A single RPG-7 rocket costs about as much as a week's worth of groceries. The tank that rocket can destroy costs as much as several apartment buildings. And this isn't an exaggeration for dramatic effect. It's the actual math of modern warfare, where a genuinely cheap weapon can wipe out equipment worth millions of dollars in a single, well-placed shot. Today, we're going to break down exactly how much the RPG-7 and its ammunition actually cost, how much the vehicles it destroys are worth, why this massive price gap isn't a coincidence but a fundamental principle behind modern asymmetrical warfare, why even the wealthiest militaries in the world have never found a simple solution to it, and what this economic imbalance actually means for the future of how wars are fought. Let's start with the launcher itself. The RPG-7 was developed in the Soviet Union in the late 1950s as a simple, cheap, and highly manufacturable infantry weapon against armored vehicles. It was meant to replace earlier, less effective anti-tank weapons and give ordinary infantry a real fighting chance against enemy armor without needing an entire logistics chain behind it. The design was deliberately stripped down to the essentials: a smoothbore tube with no rifling, minimal precision machinery, no complex electronics, no stabilization system, no advanced targeting optics beyond the basic sight. That deliberate simplicity became the key to its entire fate. Depending on the source, the production cost of a single launcher today is estimated somewhere between a few hundred and a couple $1,000s, whether it's assembled in an underground workshop with basic tools or manufactured under license in a country with a fully developed defense industry. The rocket itself is a separate story, and the price range here is just as telling. A standard anti-tank round, the PG-7B, typically costs anywhere from $50 to a few $100s, depending on the specific variant, the country producing it, and whether it's coming through a legal supply chain or a black market purchase in an active conflict zone. Compare that to a shell for a modern 120 or 125mm tank gun, which runs several $1,000s per round. And that's not manufacturer greed, it's the objective complexity of the item. It requires precision machined casing metallurgy, an explosive filler with extremely tight tolerances on composition and stability, and often a penetrator core made from depleted uranium or a tungsten alloy, a component that by itself can cost as much as a small car. Even the electronics inside some modern guided tank rounds add thousands of dollars to the final price tag. Now, let's look at the equipment all of this is used against. A modern main battle tank costs somewhere between $5 and $10 million, depending on the model, configuration, and country of manufacture. An attack helicopter costs even more, anywhere from $10 to over $30 million per unit, with some modern strike models running as high as $40 million once you factor in avionics, sensors, and weapon systems. In other words, we're talking about machinery whose price is comparable to constructing a small residential block or a large city school, and that's before counting the cost of training the crew that operates it, which itself can run into the millions over a career. And this is exactly where the real economics of asymmetrical warfare kick in. A launcher costing a couple $1,000s, firing a rocket costing a couple hundred, can, with a lucky hit on a vulnerable spot, disable or completely destroy a vehicle worth several $1,000,000. The price gap between the attacking weapon and its target can reach a 1,000-to-1 ratio, and in some cases even 10,000-to-1 when you account for the cheapest black market rockets against the most expensive modern tanks. No other category of weaponry in the history of warfare demonstrates such a striking imbalance between the cost of the attack and the cost of the target being attacked. This fundamentally changes the entire logic of how conflicts are fought. Forces that can't afford to build full tank divisions, air power, or a navy suddenly gain access to a weapon capable of effectively fighting that expensive hardware for almost nothing. That's exactly why the RPG-7 became the defining symbol of insurgencies, guerrilla groups, and militias worldwide. From Afghanistan in the 1980s, where it played a major role against Soviet armor, to conflicts across the Middle East and Africa in the decades that followed, where it remained the go-to tool against everything from armored personnel carriers to fortified checkpoints. Expensive regular army equipment suddenly becomes vulnerable to a weapon that costs less than a soldier's monthly salary, sometimes less than the cost of his own uniform and gear. There's also a flip side to this economics that people rarely think about. Modern active protection systems for tanks, the ones designed to detect and intercept incoming rockets and shells before they hit the armor, cost hundreds of thousands of dollars per unit, per vehicle. So militaries end up spending enormous sums specifically to defend against the weapon that's practically pocket change by comparison. It creates a closed loop. The cheaper and more widespread infantry anti-tank weapons become, the more expensive it gets to protect the very equipment they're aimed at. In some cases, the cost of a single active protection kit installed on one tank exceeds the cost of the combined cost of hundreds of the rockets it's designed to stop. And that doesn't even include the cost of upgrading an entire fleet of vehicles with this kind of protection, which can run into billions of dollars for a single country's armed forces. Here's a telling fact from its production history. Several million units of the RPG-7 and its many clones have been manufactured across different countries over the decades. It's been produced, licensed, and unlicensed in dozens of nations, including genuinely improvised workshops in conflict zones with no real industrial base, and sometimes without even reliable electricity. A design this simple turned out to be physically impossible to control through international arms export restrictions. The blueprints and manufacturing know-how spread across the globe decades ago, and at this point, no international agreement or sanctions regime can stop their further spread. Some estimates suggest it remains in service in one form or another with the armed forces or militias of more than 80 countries, making it arguably one of the most widely distributed weapon systems ever created. That very simplicity and cheapness is the real secret behind the RPG-7's survival on the battlefield for more than 60 years now. Modern militaries have repeatedly tried to build more advanced replacements, with laser or programmable guidance, with warheads capable of defeating modern composite and reactive armor, but none of these replacements have ever fully pushed the original out of service, precisely because none of them can compete on the cost-to-effectiveness ratio. A high-tech solution is almost always an order of magnitude, sometimes 2 orders of magnitude more expensive, and in the reality of actual combat where resources are limited and battlefield losses of equipment are constant and unavoidable, cheapness and mass availability sometimes matter more than any specification sheet drawn up in a research lab. It's also worth mentioning how this economics has played out in specific, well-documented conflicts. In urban combat, where armored vehicles are forced to move through narrow streets with limited maneuvering room, cheap handheld rocket launchers have repeatedly proven to be a decisive factor against far more expensive and technologically advanced vehicles. History records dozens of episodes where armored columns took serious losses from infantry armed with nothing more than standard RPGs, ambushing from buildings, rooftops, and alleyways, precisely where the technical superiority of armor and firepower gets neutralized by the terrain itself. Some of the most costly tank losses in recent decades of warfare trace back not to other tanks or advanced anti-tank missiles, but to infantry with rocket launchers that cost a fraction of a percent of the vehicle they destroyed. There's also a broader strategic lesson buried in all of this. Military planners have started to realize that raw technological superiority doesn't automatically translate to battlefield dominance if the cost structure of a conflict favors the side using cheaper weapons. A country can spend decades and enormous budgets developing the most advanced tank on the planet and see it disabled by a weapon designed with 1950s technology and produced for a fraction of the cost. This has pushed some militaries to rethink not just how they build vehicles, but how they think about acceptable losses, deployment tactics in urban environments, and whether pouring more money into a single expensive platform is even the right long-term strategy. This produces an interesting and in many ways unsettling paradox of modern warfare. The wealthiest militaries on Earth spend tens, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars developing, producing, and protecting a single combat vehicle, and that vehicle can be threatened by a launcher that costs less than a major car repair. And as long as this fundamental gap in economics persists, the RPG-7 and its countless counterparts around the world will remain one of the central tools of asymmetrical warfare, a weapon that wins not through superior technology, but through the simple, ruthless, and remarkably effective math of cost versus result. It's a reminder that on the modern battlefield, the deciding factor isn't always who has the most advanced machine. Sometimes it's simply who has done the math correctly.